My name is Joyce Arrowwood Smith.
What about Marie?
Marie is my middle name. My parents were Delmer and Fairlene Arrowwood. They met probably as children and kind of grew up in the same neighborhood or creek, or holler, whatever. And then Dad went away to the Navy. They wasn't dating or anything when he went to the Navy. When he come home, his lady that he was dating had started dating somebody else. So he had to move on, and that's when he met Mother. He started dating her, and so they were married. About a year and a half later, I was born. I think they only dated for a short period, maybe 6 months to a year at the most. And but they knew each other even before service, before he left for service. Her maiden name was Brewer, and she lost her dad when she was very young. Her dad died when he was 35. So Mother was, she had 2 siblings older than her, and she had brothers that were all the way down to just a few months old when her dad died. So they were left all orphans at a very young age.
Do you know how he died?
We're not sure. He had real high blood pressure. It was like a sudden death, so there's different stories on that. Some of them think he may have had an aneurysm because 2 of the boys died of aneurysms, 2 of his sons. So they kind of think that. But Aunt Fanny said that he was an alcoholic and he had a really bad drinking problem, and that she had never seen him sober as a child. So that could have been the reason for his death. But nobody really knows.
How old were Grandma and Grandpa when they got married?
They were 20 years old. Mom was 20 when her and Dad were married, and Dad was 21. So they wasn't really young when they got married because he'd already spent his time in the service, 3 years in the Navy. So he was 21, she was 20.
What about any interesting stories? Like Dad's hitchhiking story, or
for me or from my parents?
from your parents?
Oh. Mom had some interesting stories to tell of their dating and growing up. She wasn't very nice. She would track Dad down and break up card games. Dad was a gambler. The reason we wasn't allowed to have cards in the house growing up is because Dad had a gambling problem. So Mom always said, Dad said we can't have cards in the house, but sometimes I think it was also Mom didn't want cards in the house. So we didn't have any cards growing up, not even Old Maid, couldn't do any of that. One interesting thing was that the farm that Grandma and Grandpa Charlie raised their whole entire family is that Dad bought that farm for them when he came out of service. While he was in the service, he paid for them a place to live. He bought that farm. So evidently he'd saved up a little money while he was in there, and so that I'm sure that was before he, was dating Mom and thinking about marriage. Is that he brought that money and gave it to his parents. His parents lived in that house, raised their entire family, except one time they moved into their Aunt Isabella's house because she had a bigger farm than they did as far as fields, cornfields and all that. So her husband had died, so they moved in her house. And it was like a duplex back then. And Isabella had her living quarters in the back, She had her complete like a little apartment, and then Grandma and Grandpa Arrowwood all lived in the front, and so they lived there for years and rented their place out. I never could understand that, but then later on, I found out that it was because they needed that farm to raise corn and to, so they farmed the land and they could live there free. So that was the reason for them moving there for several years. But they didn't give up their place; they moved right back after the kids grew up a little bit. The house that Grandma and Grandpa lived in Copeland, and Isabella's house, they had electricity, but that was it. Nothing else, just raw light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. So, but everything else was you still had the outhouse. There was no inside plumbing, and you still had to draw water from the well and carry it in. But when they moved back to their place, I remember that they also didn't have any kind of running water, because until years later they had the pump. They could pump the water, hand pump. The kitchens in the houses that they lived in and that we lived in were, they had coal stoves, great big warmer ovens, and they were huge because they could cook huge meals because they were, it was large families. And Grandma Brewer, they had no way to heat their house. I remember they lived up on a hill, and the only way they heated their house was fireplaces, open fireplaces. But Grandma and Grandpa Arrowwood, they didn't have fireplaces. They had the big coal stoves, but the cooking was all done on coal stoves. All the food that we ate was either was grown in our own gardens. Both grandparents and Mom and Dad had huge gardens, and everything that we ate we grew from the ground, or it was killed. We always had our own cows, our own pigs and chickens. And that was interesting because the chickens was brought in boxes. And that was one of my biggest childhood memories, was all these little teeny chickens. The boxes came in with little holes all around them. So if you ordered 300 chickens, they would have 100 chickens in one of these square boxes with little holes. So out of 100, you may only get 70 chickens that were alive by the time they got to you, because they couldn't breathe in the little boxes, I guess. So that was interesting that but we loved when the new chickens came in. Loved that, because they were you would just let them loose and they would shake themselves and they were all free, and that was really cool. So we had our own chicken coops. We had what Dad called a wild strawberry patch. The strawberries was really small, but they made great jam. We picked wild blackberries. That's how we got all the blackberry pies, and made all the jellies and the jams. It was all homemade. In the gardens, they would grow these huge rows of potatoes, and then they would collect those potatoes, wrap them in a newspaper, and put them under the ground in the cellar. So as a child, my biggest fear was going to the cellar underneath a porch and having to dig out those potatoes, because I always thought there was probably more than just potatoes in that, because they covered them over with dirt. So you had to dig in the dirt, find your potato, and bring in, if Mom said, go get the potatoes, you went to the basement, it wasn't even a basement, because the house was built up on stilts because the water would come. So it was underneath the floor, and then they dug a hole like a pit, and the potatoes was in the pit. So you had to dig them out and bring them in, but they were clean because we wrapped. That was the reasoning for the wrapping of to preserve the potato. Plus, when you'd unwrap it, you had a clean potato. You didn't have all that dirt. So that was pretty interesting. In the winter time, we never ever went hungry because in the country, you work all summer to eat in the winter. You have to, if you don't put it away in the summer, you're not going to have anything to eat in the wintertime. The only thing we bought from the store was rice, meal, flour, sugar, and that's the only things we bought. We milked our own cow. If we didn't have a milk cow, we didn't drink milk, and we churned our own butter, and that was the way it was. We had vegetables because in the wintertime, plentiful, because all summer long we sat and broke beans. We chopped up all the vegetables, made relishes, and so our summer vacation from the time school was out to the time school started was working, peeling apples and putting away all the vegetables in cans. We canned everything, sealed it, and then we had pantries that were just stocked with every kind of vegetable. And that was the thing, being raised in the country. A woman's pride was to open the pantry and see how many jars of green beans and how many jars of sauerkraut and how many jars of apples and how many jars of pickled beets and all that stuff that they had preserved all summer. And they were ready for the winter. When winter came, they were ready. We never ever went hungry.